Hello and welcome to the worlds we live in. I'm Rumless, and this is my review of the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson. Um, this I started reading these three books, I think, at the beginning of July, and I finished them less than a month later. Um, that's just mostly because I'm a fast reader, but the books are also pretty good. I can't lie about that part. I think, or maybe I started reading them near the end of June. Oh yeah, I started reading them around the time I about finished Words of Radiance. And it was a wild ride. Whenever I first picked up the final Empire, I was not pulled in that easily. Its beginning was kind of boring to me, and compared to Stormlight, the world just seemed kind of dull or dry. But as I continued, eventually things started getting more interesting, and I pushed through it knowing that it was going to be good. And it was a good story. It's just that the world didn't enthrall me as much as Stormlight. I was always waiting to just get back to Stormlight and read Oathbringer. But then, by the time I finished this, when I got to the Well of Ascension, I was finally hooked. Whenever I got to the Well of Ascension, I was hooked on this world. I wanted to finish because everything was interesting, everything was awesome, and I knew this was going to be good. I'm not saying the first book was bad. I'm just saying that I did not have the best experience of it because I was attuned to a different style of world. Now I honestly think Stormlight's going to feel kind of boring once I get back to it, in the same way that Mistborn felt boring once I left Stormlight, because it's just like switching worlds, and that there's kind of a gap. And The Hero of Ages, it was an amazing conclusion, and that's a very rough summary, but that tells you nothing about whether or not you should get these books. Whether or not you should read them, whether or not you should disagree with me because you're in the fandom and have a completely different opinion and you need to get absolutely angry. No, you need to know if you want to read these books, and you need more information than just my personal experience. So, what can I tell you? Most people read books because of the characters, right? And if you're a character reader, I am pretty sure you'll be satisfied with this. I am not a character reader. I am a world reader. But every single one of the characters that Sanderson introduced in this trilogy pulled me in. I feel like I'm banging these books too much on the table, and that's going to reduce the quality. So I'm going to stop. Every single one of the characters pulled me in. No matter which main character you pick out, I think their story arc was masterfully done on every step of the way, and each one of the characters' stories concluded amazingly. To not get into major spoilers, there is one character you'll barely notice, and I'm mentioning him because he plays a minor role. Demo, who you won't notice in the first book, if you notice him at all, but he'll be referred back to in the second book. He's somewhat important there, and then he gains his most importance in the last book, but the entire time, his story has something to do with the army, and it concludes with him being a really important member of the army. So his story was just kind of rising through the ranks as a loyal follower of Kelsier and his crew. I mean, and you've got Sazed and his arc going from the Universalist to the religious Universalist to his conclusion in the last book, and that entire journey. It was astounding. And that's not to mention the two main characters, Elend and Vin, who have equally amazing arcs. I genuinely don't want to say that they have the best arcs of the entire story, but rather I'd say they have the top four arcs of the story. The top four arcs are, of course, going to be Vin, Elend, Sazed, and I don't think I want to mention the last one. But if I had to raise it to, oh, if I had to raise it to, yeah, no, those two characters. The Khandra, he's not in the top four, my top four, but he's definitely in my top six. And once you get to the top six, Kelsier's in there somewhere, but you don't get to know who number 4 is until you read the last book. Pewter. Well, that's it for characters. All the characters concluded really well. I can pick out an arc. Every single one was amazing. And I'm not exaggerating. Like, maybe I should just pick out one. Okay, let's go with... No, I've already picked out enough. So now to the world. That was a bad transition. Well, the world. The first thing I notice when I pick up any fantasy book is the map. And the map of the Final Empire. I've got nothing good to say about it. At least as a map itself. As far as I'm concerned, this mess is a mix of some sort of Balerian and some sort of Mistwraith or something. And Balerians, that's in Tolkien. It's definitely the worst of the two maps of the Northwest to Middle Earth. The Balerian map is. And so this is definitely one of the this is not one of the best maps I've ever seen. Yeah, it has some interesting stuff on it, but it kind of looks like a blob to me. And I know someone would be saying like, oh, it's just a map, like geography, you can't be too critical about those kind of things. And it's like, okay, geography and maps are the things I care the most about, and so I kind of want to criticize them whenever I have reasons to. However, and this will be a theme from now on, even though the geography of the Final Empire and the map was disgusting, as the series continued on and I learned more about the world's history, the actual disgusting look of the map became a feature instead of a flaw, because because the landmass is in a certain way artificial. It's not right. It isn't original. And because of that, I kind of realized that, yeah, this kind of messy look, it totally works for the map of the Final Empire. Because it's not natural. And it doesn't need to look that way. And beyond that, let's get beyond that. The history of the Mistborn of Scadrial. As I was reading the first book, one of the things that definitely kept me going was I kept on noticing that the history felt developed. He kept on mentioning events from this century, that century, 5th century, 3rd century, 7th century, 8th century. It's just like these events keep on being referred to on the side by characters, and they say which century it's in, and you don't really get a lot of details about the history, but what you do get is a feeling that this world is lived in, that it has had at least 1,000 years of history from the beginning to the end of the Lord Ruler's reign, even if you don't get to read basically any of that history. And because of that, I liked the world better than I actually like the Stormlight world better than I like the Roshar. I think the history of Mistborn was displayed better than at least the history of Roshar and the Way of Kings. So, Mistborn, it has amazing characters, geography, history works. The magic system is, of course, one of the top you've ever seen. It's become the gold standard for hard magic systems and all of fantasy. But that's I have to look at my notes. But oh yeah. Not all the magic systems were appreciated by me. There are a few different magic systems in Mistborn. Slight spoilers, because I'm going to mention one of them. Each of these books introduces an important magic system. The last book focuses on hemalurgy. And I'd say that hemalurgy is terrible. I mean, I would want feruchemy for my normal daily life. Allomancy is great for armies, but the only reason I can think you would use hemalurgy in even a slightly moral way is to punish criminals. And then maybe use them to make Khandra or something. The hemalurgy was... No, just... Yeah, it's definitely the power of a villain. But despite the unsettling aspects of the evil magic system, which you would expect it to have some, nonetheless, the magic in the Mistborn trilogy is amazing. The entire world is amazing. The fantasy species introduced in the books each have their own unique aspects. You have humans, Khandra, and Kolos. At least, that's all I think there are. And humans are obviously what you would expect, but then Khandra and Kolos, as they get introduced, they all play unique roles that are really interesting. And of course, there's the cities. That's kind of in the geography section, but I haven't mentioned them. There are 3 cities that have stories in the Mistborn trilogy that you really focus on. And you'd expect me to say that there's 1 city per book, right? But no, there's not 1 city per book. Both of these first 2 books take place almost entirely in Luthadel. And then the Hero of Ages takes place in 2 completely different cities. Tio and Fadrex City. So, the different cities, I did not exactly notice anything unique about each of their cultures, though I guess that's kind of expected, and since the world is kind of ending, I don't think there's much time for culture, but they all did have unique histories, unique geographies inside them. Like, Luthadel is obviously the capital of everything. It has... the map takes up 2 pages. It has a lot of houses. There's Kredik Shah. There's a massive river running in the middle of it. And, yeah. It's just... It's great that he came up with 3 unique urban settings for his world, and that's just something I really appreciate. Each of the cities felt unique. There was Luthadel with its sprawling, massive things and government stuff. Ertwo, Ert, 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 Ertiao, with its canals. Well, actually, the heroes that become canals. And then there's Fadrex City, ruled by a religious person. That's a very bad explanation. Essentially, yeah, all of the different settings in the book were unique. That's all I have to say. And now on to the plot, because the plot does have something extremely interesting. Notably, in most stories, you have one villain for the entire series. That's just what it seems like is the case for most series. It's the case in Stormlight, apparently, or at least it's the case in Stormlight so far. And it's the case in The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, which is one book, but, and so you would kind of expect that with Mistborn, right? 3 books, 1 villain, but no, it's 3 books, 3 villains. So somehow, so that obviously spoils that they're going to defeat the first villain, and they're also going to defeat the second villain, because otherwise the second villain would be in the same place as the third villain. But there's 3 different villains, and you'd think that after each of the villains were defeated, that would remove the tension in the story. But no, it doesn't. After the Lord Ruler is defeated, you still want to kind of know what happens after Elend makes himself king. But okay, that's not much. Then, the Well of Ascension did not get much of a tension. The final Empire did not provide the Well of Ascension with much tension leading up to it. And so, yeah, you could kind of say the tension in the final Empire died out when the Lord Ruler died, or at least most of it did. And so the Well of Ascension did have to build up tension really quick. It had to show you that this battle was going to be hard, that they were going to fight, and that this new villain, Elend's father, was dangerous. And Sanderson built up tension well in this book. Somehow, he made the villains less powerful, the heroes more powerful, and raised the stakes. That's not something that's common. Give the heroes an upgrade and give the villains a downgrade and still somehow make things more tense. That's what it felt like with this book. And I guess that's because the villains, even though they had less power, were bringing all of their power to the table, whereas in this book, even though the Lord Ruler had access to all of the Final Empire, he never really got to use much of it against Kelsier and his crew, which makes sense. And the Well of Ascension, it does make things tense right away. It makes things really difficult right away. You worry for Vin right after the second chapter. You talk to her, where you read about her, and its conclusion does not deal with the tension, because the conclusion of the Well of Ascension, the second villain's defeated, but a much worse villain is released. And that's, of course, where the Hero of Ages comes in. And to stop this rant, all I'm trying to say is that in each of the 3 books, the plot is focused around fighting a completely different set of villains. And even though the villains change, the tension doesn't stop. Things don't get easier. And that makes the story really fun. I almost feel like I could skip the first book and just read Well of Ascension and The Hero of Ages, but I kind of feel like I missed out on a little bit if I did that. And yeah, this book was also, The Hero of Ages was also great. And to get back to characters, specifically the villain characters, the way that Brandon Sanderson actually did provide one of his main villains with a redemption arc, but it only occurred after they died, which was awesome. That I got to see one of the villains experience a redemption arc, or more accurately, as the heroes learned more about the Lord Ruler, which they killed, they realized that he wasn't as much of a villain as they originally thought. One of the things that kind of maybe ruins this series for some people after they read the first book, and luckily this problem really is only in the first book, is apparent Deus Ex Machina events that kind of give the heroes the ability to win when they would have died. And those events do happen, and they do kind of remove the tension from the story when you first read them. But one of those events does happen in The Hero of Ages. In fact, it's identical to one of them that happened in Mistborn. Another one of the Deus Ex Machinas is the same. It just keeps on going throughout the entire series, but you kind of get used to it because it's not that big of a deal. It's just piercing copper clouds. And luckily, it's not as big of a problem as you might think. It's only in the first book, and every single one of the Deus Ex Machinas are explained are explained in the third book, and provide amazing aha moments that release the tension and make the final victory in the Hero of Ages feel even more deserved. And also kind of makes you realize how much they stumbled into victory when they got in the first book. So that is overall what I have to say about Mistborn Era 1. I would give it 5 stars, the entire thing. And I know some people might give lower reviews because, aren't there flaws with it? Well, yes, there's tiny flaws. But whenever it comes down to it, every character was done amazingly. All the elements of the world made sense, even the ones like how the Final Empire treated mixed ska and noble children. Even that made sense. Even though Sanderson himself thinks it's illogical, that makes sense. And I wish I had more time to explain. And the plot also concludes in a really amazing way. Even though the strong conclusion even though to get the strong conclusion in the third book, Sanderson had to sacrifice some of the strength of his first book's conclusion, it still went really well. And because of that, I really have nothing bad to say about it. It's all good. And even though I know the second era is not going to be as good from what I hear, I haven't read it, but even though I know it's not going to be as good, the epilogue and the Hero of Ages definitely makes me want to read it because I just want to see what that new world is like and maybe know how Spook's doing. And that's all. See ya.